Hey there, and welcome to Into the Terminal, episode 103. Today we're going to be discussing techniques for troubleshooting SELinux.
Hello, Internet people. So why don't we just jump right on in? And I saw that Vincent mentioned in the chat early before we started the stream about disabling. Well, guess what? We're kind of going to do that, but with a caveat. All right, so first off, let's introduce the problem. So if hold on, I got to change my screen share.
Man, where's Nate when you need him?
I know. It just all falls apart without him. All right. So here's my screen share, and you can see that I got two tabs in my browser. And what I want to show you is that I have this index file in var www.html. That's my index, right, for my super businessy website. And yet, when I browse to the server, that's not what I'm seeing. All right, so I'm not able to get my super businessy website. And if I take a look at the error messages in the web server error log, I get some like weird thing like this or this. All right, the permissions is denied to this resource. All right, so permission denied is actually one of those classic SELinux misdirects. In reality, remember in our last episode, we were talking about how SELinux works. And what's happened is the web server has requested to access this file. SELinux has checked the policy of rules along with the properties of the daemon requesting the file and the file itself, and determined this access is against the policy, and so it refuses it. But Apache has no idea that it's being run with SELinux, so all it gets is from a kernel an error message that says that the file is not permitted to it, which it represents as a permission error, because that's usually what would cause such a thing. But we know better. We know that SELinux is the culprit here because, one, I told you earlier, and two, we're going to take a closer look at it. All right. So really quick, because we're talking about troubleshooting. How do we know it's an SELinux problem, right? It's a permission problem. And if we looked at the permissions and went down that rabbit trail, like everything would look fine, and we wouldn't be able to understand why we were getting a permission denied error. So what we're going to do, Vincent, is we're going to turn off SELinux temporarily. Not really turn it off, but put it in permissive mode. All right, so if I look at my SE status now, SELinux is enabled, and my current mode is enforcing. And so what I'm going to do is a set enforce. Thank you. Set enforce 0. And what this does is it in memory changes the enforcement mode for SELinux. So, right, still enabled, just like before, but now it's running in permissive mode. All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over to my website. I'm going to hit the reload button, and there's my super businessy website.
Hey!
Right, so
love it when that happens.
I turned SELinux into permissive mode. All of a sudden, things started working again. So I'm going to do one more thing, which is I'm going to set enforce 1. Right, putting it back into enforcing mode. And I go back over to my web browser. It broke again. All right, so just this really simple diagnostic tool of set it in permissive mode, do the thing that you're having problems with, and then set it into enforcing mode, do the thing you're having problems with to see if the problem remanifests itself. That confirms that this is likely an SELinux problem, right? If we set it into permissive mode and it was still a problem, well, we removed SELinux from the equation, so it's probably not an SELinux problem. It's probably something else. So I don't mind turning it into permissive mode temporarily as a diagnostic tool for verifying what's going on. All right, so to just
Don't worry,
kind of
Jeff.
like
Jeff was really concerned about that.
right. I mean, I made Dan Walsh cry, but only for a little bit because I turned it back on.
It was one tier.
That's right. So In our last show, we talked some about contexts and ports and all kinds of other moving pieces with the SELinux policy. Today, we're going to go into a little bit more depth, but let's go ahead and finish out this issue. So the issue, it turns out, is the index file. I created it in root's home and then moved it over the document root. And so the problem is that the context, right, this right here, the type of file that this is set incorrectly. And so when Apache asks to access this file, SELinux looks in or the kernel looks in the SELinux policy, sees that it's admin home t type file, and that is not a type of file that Apache is allowed to access. So it refuses the access. But if we storecon, right, which restores its context to be appropriate for the place it's currently residing, right? It flops it to HTTPD syscontent t type. That is a type that Apache has access to. So if I go back over to my web page here and hit refresh, right, I've solved the problem, right? I made sure that the context of my index matches the context of my process, and everything is good. All right. So that's a very, very quick how to troubleshoot SELinux in a super every tool is a hammer kind of way of set it to permissive. Is the problem go away? Set it to enforcing. Does the problem come back? That's how you know. Stay with us after the transition where we go into more on policy details, and we'll actually be reproducing this error and solving it in a different way of making some additions to the policy so that this is a context type that is allowed to Apache. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You want us to keep making the content, bang that like button, and then get notified whenever we make content with subscribing. Eric, any last words before we transition?
Just like and subscribe, because if we can get more likes on this, then I have something to tease Nate about on Monday.
All right.
Well, it's good to be back on Into the Terminal. You and I launched this over like 2 years ago, and it's still going strong. Just broke 100 episodes, so really glad to be back.
Yeah, thanks for guest hosting. Nate being out doing actual work put a damper on things. So it's nice to see you again, Eric.
For sure. Usually
Shall we
behind the
jump?
scenes, clicking the buttons.
That's right. Shall we jump back into the terminal?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So let me go ahead and recreate this problem again. Man, I could type. Here we go. And
This is what
move
happens when
this.
we don't pre-write out our commands.
Okay. All right. So I recreated the same problem, right? Where I have a context mismatch between the index file and what context Apache is running as. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about policy. So the SELinux policy and all the configuration for it lives in Etsy. Right. So if we go into Etsy SELinux, right, this is where all the stuff is. So we can look at the config, and that's what tells us things like what our default state should be. There are 3 states: enforcing, which is what we like; permissive, where the policy still gets checked, but violations don't stop things from happening. That's what we're using in our critical path diagnosis of our problem. And the third type you don't want to use anymore. Let me say that again. The third type you don't want to use anymore, and that's disabled. If you disable it for RHEL 9 and later, your machine will no longer boot. You're welcome. So keep it in enforcing or permissive, but my preference, of course, is enforcing. All right. And then the other thing that we have down here is the SELinux policy name. So we're using the targeted policy. There are other ones that ship with RHEL, but this one is the default and is probably the most commonly used. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. And you can see that in our etc SELinux directory, there's a subdirectory for the targeted policy. So we can go in there. And there's some configuration stuff there. And probably what we'd be interested in is policy. So notice that it's policy.33, just weird coincidence. You like that, Eric? You like that word?
I always heard it quinkadink.
So right here, the kernel policy version is 33. So policy 33 is version 33. All right, so let's do a less on that policy. So this is
At
a
least it
compiled
asked.
binary, right? That's right. That's because I used less. If I'd used cat, it would have just gone to the races. So this is a compiled binary, and it gets loaded into memory so that the kernel can access it in a fastest way possible for looking up rules and how to interact between targeted daemons and processes and resources on the machine like ports, files, users, etc. All right, so no, I'm not going to take a look at it. However, there is another tool that will allow us to look at this policy. So it's called sedispol, right? It's SELinux display policy. And we can tell it to display policy 33. So it loads that binary into the application, and then it says, all right, what do you want to do with this policy? And there's a whole bunch of options for what you can do. And I'm going to show you this, but we're not going to spend a lot of time in it because we're going to work on some other stuff instead. But I want to show you that you could, in fact, look up the rules and like get into all the weedy, disgusting details if you wanted to using this tool, sedispol. So maybe I want to look at 3. Conditional AV tab enabled rules only. Right, so these are all the rules that kind of control how my system interacts with stuff. And so what we get is an allow or deny, the context of the process, and then over here, what is being limited. So this is a process limitation for executing memory, or a process limitation for executing stack memory, or I'm trying to find one that's a little bit more, right here. So this is a allow rule that allows a FIFO file to be created, changed, like permissions or ownerships. The attributes of it can be changed, removed. That's what unlink means. Link, created, or rename. Right, changing its file name. And there's others as well, but like open or get adder to get the attributes of a file. We're going to see that in just a minute as well. So this is the giant list. And notice there wasn't any HTTPD stuff here because it scrolled away so quickly because it's a giant list. But this is what a policy looks like. All right.
So as a former sysadmin, I don't know that I'd ever gone into the policies themselves. In your experience, what would be a common use case for going in and looking at the policy?
Well, so one of the folks earlier asked if we were going to make a custom policy today. And so if you're planning on making a custom policy, you probably want to know what's in there, what's in the policy you're using today. The other thing is we talked last episode about file contexts and port contexts, and I very hand wavily said, Apache HTTPD type daemons are allowed this, but not allowed that. But how do you know? Right. So the only way you could really know is by going into the policy to look at the rules that allow it or deny it. And so I had done that in the past, which is why I could very hand-wavily answer, yeah, this works or this doesn't work. But that's how you know for sure, is by reading the rules themselves.
And we did have one other question real quick, talking about versions. Let me pull it up here on the screen. Frank asks if I can multitask today. There we go. Can you configure SELinux so that it also maintains older versions so that rollback is possible?
Probably in some super horrible way. But that's not the default, so it wouldn't be my recommendation. What happens is when you apply an SELinux policy update, like you get a SELinux targeted policy update from Red Hat, it'll actually remove the old policy and then install the new policy in its place. And you'll notice that there will be a version increment. So it won't be policy 33 anymore. It'll be something later. And so to revert it back, you would need to downgrade that package from whatever it is currently back to version 33 or the previous version, the SELinux policy RPM that you got. In theory, you could do some other stuff like install it in a change rooted environment. So you're like storing it in a separate file system or directory structure on the machine. But that seems like a lot of work for not a lot of benefit. But you can literally just downgrade the package to the previous version and get back to what you had before. All right.
Frank, I thought we were going to stump him that time.
Yeah. I mean, maybe. All right. So let's get back to our problem at hand. Because one of the other common things to do is make some slight adjustments to the policy. So in our last episode, we were talking about putting things where they belong, right? Where Red Hat expects to find them. And that's one of the ways that you can steer clear of SELinux problems. But what if you can't do that? So in our last episode, we created a website called /website, and that's where we put all of our web content. And as much as we are system administrators and we try to guide people on the correct path, sometimes they just make decisions and we have to live with them. So what we did last time was we adjusted /website to have different contexts, and that made everything okay. But another way that you could adjust it is using a tool called audit to allow. So that will actually change the policy rules. So instead of taking your file contents and saying, I'm going to change the context of the files to make it comply with the policy I have in place, instead you're going to say, the files I have are the files I have, and I need to adjust the policy to allow access to the files I have. And this is a much more difficult method for making the change. But it's one that can be done. And there are some byproducts that you need to be aware of before you go down this route. All right. So first, let me make some windows here. Control B, quote. Oh, helps if you run tmux before you start sending tmux commands. All right. So here I have two windows. All right. So the first one I'm going to wget. All right, so I get my error there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to this upper one. And I'm going to do a tail-f on var log messages. All right. And so what we see is when we do this request, and do it again, all of a sudden a bunch of stuff comes in about SELinux into the var log messages. So what we're looking at is the output of two things. One is the ABC service, and the other is a daemon that is running called set troubleshoot D or SE troubleshoot D. And so SE troubleshoot D is actually giving us some direction on what the problem might be. In fact, it says like, hey, if you run restorecon on this thing, this error will go away. Right? So usually it's pretty good at making recommendations. But we're going to ignore its recommendations and do things differently in a much harder way, because that's how we are. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run audit to allow -w-a. All right, and what this does is it goes into the logs and it says, all right, here's an error where SELinux stopped a thing from happening. And you can see the details of the error right here. Okay, it denied a get attribute request from this command on this file. And then it gives a little bit more detail, like the source context, right? The daemon asking for this thing is httpdt, and the target context, the file it's asking for, is admin home t. So that's the problem, right? There's a context mismatch, and based on the policy of rules, we denied this get attribute request that this daemon was making for this file. And then notice at the bottom it says, oh, by the way, you can use audit to allow to make a loadable module for this thing. All right, so we can do a audit to allow -a. And it says, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to add to the policy and allow for HTTPDT type things to an admin home T file. And we're going to allow it to get attribute, open, and read it. And so if that's what you want to do, we're going to make a module. And I'm going to call my module Apache content. Okay, so what has happened is here in this directory I'm working in, it made this little policy patch. And it's based off the rules in this Apache content TE. So if I do a less on Apache content TE, this is the module patch that we're going to stick into our SELinux policy, right? So right here, we're going to put in a new allow rule in our policy for HTTPDT type applications to allow them admin home T files, and we're going to allow it to get adder, open, and read those files. All right. So now that I made my little policy patch, I'm going to SE module -I, and that's going to compile it and insert it into the policy.
So this was probably about as close as I ever came as a sysadmin to generating a custom policy, basically tweaking an existing one. I can remember running RHEL 6 systems, and SELinux policies for workloads that ran on top of RHEL weren't as prolific as they are now, where pretty much every package we support has some sort of SELinux policy. But back in the day, if you just put it into permissive mode, ran your usual operations like go to this page, download this file, go through the typical operations, you could generate that and then use audit to allow to basically tweak the existing policy instead of creating something from scratch.
Yeah, and it's important to note that this PP file and the TE file that we created, that's portable, right? So if we went to another machine that had the same targeted policy, we could do an SE module -I Apache content PP, and it would use those rules to insert our policy patch into the existing policy on the machine, right? So this thing is a portable unit that you can then smear across all your other systems.
Now
All
he's
right, so let's do our wget again. Oh, that looks good. Let's flip over to our thing here, and we get our super businessy website. So that's good. Excellent. So there we go. We've modified the policy. And if we do an SE status, all right, we're still running version 33 because we used that as our main core policy, and then we inserted this additional policy module into it. All right, so that's the bad way, or not bad, but the more difficult way of adjusting your policy. Now, but I said there was a caveat to this method. So remember how SELinux is designed to keep things from doing stuff they shouldn't be allowed to?
I remember
Well,
vaguely you saying something like that.
right. Oops, TE. So here's our rule. What we did was we changed our policy to allow Apache content to come from admin home T files. So what this means is if for some reason somebody created a symbolic link inside of the Apache document root to root's home directory, well, the stuff in root's home directory is admin home T type. And now, according to our modified policy, that's permissible to Apache. So, you know, Audit to allow is great in that it's pretty simple to create these policy extensions that allow you to update your policy to allow things to happen that were being blocked. But in this case, like, do we really want to allow Apache to go into root's home and root around and get stuff? Because that's what we've made. So in this case, again, I think the restore con or adding additional file context to an alternate web document root would have been the better way to go. But for some reason, you're not able to do it, or you're trying to make a policy adjustment to allow an application that is not something well known like Apache, this would be a way that you could make those changes. All right. So I think that runs us off our prepared list of topics today, Eric. Any questions?
Yeah, we had a couple of questions in chat. Let me pull those up here. So Ahmed asks if it's possible to list all the policies on a system.
So basically, good question. Typically, we'll look at like was it SEPol, sedispol? Man, it's a rough day. To display the policy. And let's see. 1 second. I want to see if it put our stuff in the targeted directory. No. Yeah, I'll have to see where where that little patch goes. It's been inserted into memory, but how do we make that permanent is a great question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. So I'll do a little research and I'll put it in the comments of the video after I find out.
Okay. And we'll ask this question from Frank as well. Are the PPTE files copied to another location using semodule-I, or do I need the PPTE files at that path after a restart? And I think that's kind of what we're getting into here as well.
Yeah. So I think you want SE module. I created them in root's home, which isn't a great place for them. So we probably, if we're going to be doing this in more permanent fashion, we probably want to store them somewhere else instead of root's home.
And that runs us off the questions I'd kind of bookmarked.
Awesome. Well, there we go. See, Nate's not here and we end on time, Eric.
Oh, if he weren't on an airplane right now, that would be so much fun.
So next week, Nate will actually be back and he'll be doing local virtualization management.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that episode. Using RHEL to run virtual machines is so amazing. In fact, my home lab for a long time was just a RHEL 9 box with Podman containers and virtual machines. So I'm really looking forward to that episode.
And then in just a couple weeks, you'll be doing something interesting on RHEL Presents.
Actually, I'll be out of the office that day, so Nate is going to jump onto RHEL Presents, filling in for me, and we'll be meeting with one of the product managers and one of the engineers that works on Podman Desktop. We'll talk about Quadlet and some more containery things for RHEL. So a lot of cool stuff coming. Little bit of a sneak peek at what's coming in Podman 4.9. A look at what's on the agenda for Podman 5.0. So lots of cool stuff. Looking forward to catching Brian and Nate on RHEL Presents. And last but not least, if you haven't already, Red Hat Summit is coming up. So if you can make your way to Denver, Colorado, you should definitely join us there. I know Scott, Nate, and a bunch of our friends will be there. I think Brian will be there. So lots of us want to be hanging out. Make sure to stop by the RHEL booth. We'll try and do some selfies or do some kind of challenges or something. I don't know that we've figured that out yet, but we'll be there.
I will do no selfies. I am super crabby.
He is.
Work a booth. They don't like me to work the booth because people walk up and I'm like, "Who are you? Go away."
He's not wrong.
That's right.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Chat was amazing, but the conversation doesn't end here because we just stood up a brand new Discord server. It's the RHEL Live Discord. You can grab the QR code, or you can grab the link in the show notes. I'll have those up and edited here in about the next 10 minutes or so. So definitely the conversation will keep on going. Take your questions there, and if we can't answer them, I'm hoping to build a community where we can get those questions answered. So the live chat will be there. There's rooms for different shows. I think we've got like a career, like a job posting channel. So if you know of a position open, like our team is hiring on the product management side, so you can go check that out. So the conversation doesn't stop here. Look forward to catching you all next week on Into the Terminal and RHEL Presents. So thank you all for joining us. And Scott, any closing thoughts?
Happy into the terminaling, everyone. Wow. Woof. Let me try that again. Happy into the terminaling.
It's one of those days. All right, folks. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you again soon.